Hello, kiddos. Welcome to video number 2. I know you're so excited to learn about US versus Nixon, so we're going to jump right in. To let you know what we're going to do in this video, Ms. Crowe and I are going to go over your case annotations. I have mine here on paper, and she's got this lovely dot cam that you can see on the left side of your screen. Ms. Crowe will be doing them in real time. Because our classes do slightly different annotations, I'll be jumping in every so often just to make sure that my classes understand how my annotations would work, but they're pretty much mostly the same. So as we go through, I think you guys will still be able to follow the way Ms. Crowe's class does her annotations. You guys, we've talked a little bit about this case before. Nixon was the president who was almost impeached, but not quite. So we get to learn more about it today in our Supreme Court case study, 49. Ms. Crowe, you want to get it rolling?
Sure. So as Ms. MacLean said, this is US versus Nixon, 1974. I've got my pen here, I've got a highlighter. So my highlighter is for things I absolutely need to know. Like, my understanding of this case is not going to make sense without this information. My pen, I'm going to underline some things. Those things are nice to know. They might be some background information things. They might be some like, oh, I feel like that's really cool things, but they're not extremely important. So we're going to start with the background of our case here. If you have your paper, you're welcome to follow along. If you don't have your paper, that is on the class website. Go print one out. Once we're done reading, we'll write our one sentence summary over here. Ms. MacLean and I will create one together once we get there. All right, so during President Nixon's 1972 re-election campaign, several men were caught breaking into the Democratic National Committee's headquarters in the Watergate apartment and office complex in Washington, D.C. It turned out that the burglars were associated with the president's campaign. A nationwide political and public outcry mushroomed into what became known as the Watergate scandal. So if I'm reflecting on that paragraph here, this first sentence sounds pretty important. I mean, that's where an actual crime is being committed. So I'm going to highlight the most important sections of that. So several men were caught breaking into the Democratic National Committee's headquarters in the Watergate apartment and office complex in Washington, D.C. Okay. Now, I need to bring the president into this, so I'm also going to highlight the next sentence. It turned out the burglars were associated with the president's campaign. This nationwide outcry is nice to know. So I'm going to underline that. Okay. Moving right along, the United States Department of Justice appointed a special prosecutor to carry out an independent investigation of the scandal. From the investigation, trials of various White House staff members, investigative newspaper reports, and televised Senate Select Committee investigative hearings shocked a nation that learned that the White House was involved in planning and covering up the burglary. Now, most of this is just kind of nice. I'd say the most important thing is this very last part. The nation learned that the White House was involved in planning and covering up the burglary.
So my kiddos, we underline the things that are important to know. We box the crucial things. So the things that you see Ms. Crowe's highlighted, you guys would be boxing that in my class.
Okay, I'm just underlining that there was an independent investigation of the scandal. When it was revealed that the president had taped many conversations in the White House Oval Office, both Senate Investigating Committee and the special prosecutor attempted to secure the tapes. The president refused to release them, claiming separation of powers and executive privilege, the right of the president to keep his conversations confidential. The special prosecutor subpoenaed the tapes, and a federal judge ordered President Nixon to release them. Nixon refused and instead turned to the Supreme Court for a judgment on executive privilege. Okay, my opinion, Ms. MacLean, you can tell me if you agree, lots of important things happening in this paragraph.
Yeah, a ton, I agree.
Okay. So the president had taped many conversations in the Oval Office. I'm going to highlight that. The Senate tries to secure the tapes. The president refused to release them, claiming separation of powers and executive privilege.
And Ms. Crowe, I don't know if you guys do this, but in my class right here, we'd stop and we'd be like, let's define executive privilege off to the side, because we know that's going to be a crucial word. So like, we should recognize that word. Let's write it down right off to the side to talk about like what it means.
Awesome. Why don't you go ahead and define executive privilege, Ms. MacLean? Can you also tell us about this word subpoenaed?
I would love to tell you about that word. That's one of my favorite words. So let's start off with executive privilege. Hopefully you guys recognize that from the last video we did. So executive privilege are when the president claims that information that he has is secret and needs to be held secret for national security. So it's when the president keeps information secret, usually for national security reasons.
I'm just writing that down.
All good. Keeping info secret. And this is something the president gets to do. It's one of his informal powers. Now, you're also going to need to know that the prosecutor tried to subpoena the tapes. A subpoena is an order from a court saying you have to give us certain information. So the president said, no, I'm going to keep these secret. And the special prosecutor was like, no, you aren't. I'm going to subpoena them. I'm going to have the court order you to show them to us. A subpoena can also be if you need someone to be a witness, you can subpoena someone to testify in court. So it's a court order to get certain information.
Awesome. Now we're ready for our summary. So remember, we're just doing one sentence, what happened? So I know that the Democratic National Committee's headquarters were broken into. I know that the president was somehow associated with that and that he refused to turn over information. So let's go ahead and turn that into a sentence.
Ms. Crowe, so what's happened? Do you think it would be important for me to talk about like how the president also claimed like executive privilege? Do you think that should be in our sentence, or do you think that should be later on?
No, I think that should be in our sentence for sure. So after a burglary at the Watergate, the president was found to be involved and had information that he kept claiming executive privilege. How do we feel about that, Ms. MacLean?
I really like that. I don't think I would add anything to it. All I would say is, my kiddos, don't you feel lucky you get to look at Ms. Crowe's handwriting and not mine?
It's a little questionable today, but thank you.
Trust me, it's still better.
All right, so we're talking about our constitutional issues here. Our goal for that is to make a list out to the side of questions about this case that the Supreme Court would need to answer. And Ms. MacLean, I know you do something very similar, right?
Yep. So we do something similar. We make a sentence. We say, what's the most important question? We make like a sentence out of it with a question mark at the end. For this, I would like to do it your way though. If you guys have like multiple questions that you want to list out, I'm totally okay with that. It gets the same information in the end.
Sure. All right, so for this little box here, we've got the question for the court was to decide whether the president could refuse to surrender the tapes and other information to a federal court for possible use against those charged in connection with the Watergate break-in. So I'm just going to highlight real quick the most important part of that. Sorry, my other computer just went funny. They had to decide whether the president could refuse to surrender the tapes and other information to a federal court. Okay. So our question then becomes, could the president refuse to surrender the tapes and other information?
Yep. Could he keep the tapes secret is what I wrote, but basically the same thing. And my kiddos, I usually have you guys tell me what article of the Constitution this comes from. If we're talking about the presidency, this is going to be in Article 2, right? So it'll be under Article 2 is where they're going to look legally to answer this question.
I would say probably to a lesser extent, a second question, does this fall under executive privilege? That's kind of what we have here. All right. Ms. MacLean, do you see any more questions here that the court would need to answer?
I think those are the good ones the court needs to answer. I would point out the second one that we asked, does this fall under executive privilege? It's kind of an expansion of what we were talking about in the notes, where we said that informal powers tend to expand rather than retract, right? So be looking and be asking yourself as we read the decision, is this decision giving the presidency more or less power in the long run?
So more or less power for the president. All right, let's find out what the Supreme Court had to say. Oh, before we forget, we got one more thing to add up here at the top, and that is our jurisdiction.
Oh yes, that's important.
Now, I didn't see the word appeal up here in the background. Did you, Ms. MacLean?
No, I never caught that word, and I don't think I saw a mention of any other court either.
All right, so that means our jurisdiction has to be original.
Only the Supreme Court, guys. Original. Only the Supreme Court.
Okay, moving back down to the decision. The court agreed unanimously, so that's our type of opinion here, that the president had to turn over the tapes. Chief Justice Warren E. Burger wrote for the court. President Nixon had argued that the courts had no jurisdiction over what he claimed was a dispute between the president and his subordinate, the special prosecutor. The court responded that it was competent to decide the case, just as it had decided similar controversies between officers and branches of government in the past. In addition, because the material was wanted for a normal federal criminal trial, the matter fell directly under the court's jurisdiction through the judicial power spelled out in Article 3 of the Constitution. Have we answered any of these questions yet, do you think?
I mean, I think we definitely answered the first one. Can he keep the tape secret?
Okay, and the court said?
No.
No. So the president had to turn over the tapes. Okay, so I'm going to write that off to this side. So answer number 1. Could the president refuse to surrender the tapes? No. He had to turn them over.
And I would even point out, guys, Ms. MacLean learned something. I thought it was going to be under Article 2 because it's about the presidency, but they actually found their answer in Article 3, like it says in the very last sentence. So I would definitely box that because that's going to be important. Or highlight it in Ms. Crowe's terms.
There we go.
Yeah.
All right. Is there anything else you feel is really important in this paragraph?
There wasn't really anything else that I said was super, super important. Some of it was nice to know, but nothing worthy of a highlight.
Okay. We'll head to the next little paragraph there at the very bottom of the page then. The president had also claimed that executive privilege shielded him from a subpoena for 2 reasons. First, it was necessary to protect the confidentiality of high-level presidential communications. Second, the principle of separation of powers protects the president through the independence of the executive branch. Now, this doesn't really have a lot to do with the court or kind of answering these questions. These are Nixon's reasons for not doing it. So while this is like nice to know, so I'd be underlining here, I don't feel there's anything really worthy of a highlight or that we have answered any of these questions.
Yeah, I would agree. All I did was underline executive privilege shielded him from a subpoena for 2 reasons, just so that I would know what this paragraph was talking about and that he was claiming executive privilege.
On the back side, the court found this argument insufficient, depending merely on a broad and undifferentiated claim of public interest that such conversations remain confidential. It may have been different, the Chief Justice wrote, if this had been a claim to protect, quote, military, diplomatic, or sensitive national security secrets, end quote. Now the court's talking again, so let's check our questions and see if we've answered anything here. So we answered number 1. What do you think about number 2 here, Ms. MacLean? Does this fall under executive privilege?
Well, the court seems to define executive privilege here as military, diplomatic, or sensitive national secrets. So they basically said because it's only a claim of public interest, it doesn't seem to be those things. So I would say this does answer our question. And the answer that I see is that no, it doesn't fall under that.
Okay, so they found this argument insufficient. That's our no. So answer number 2. No, this is not executive privilege.
And you guys remember how in our notes we were saying that executive privilege was usually about national security secrets? That's where this comes from. This quote that you guys are reading here, this is what established that. So you guys are going to be wanting, when you're thinking about the precedent, about how this affects the future, you're going to want to go back to this quote over here. So I went ahead and underlined it. Military, diplomatic, or sensitive national security secrets.
That's what's included in executive privilege.
Yeah, so just keep that in the back of your mind for later.
Sorry guys, I'm getting emails. All right, Chief Justice Berger further reasoned that the claim based on the separation of powers would work to impair the balance of those powers. He wrote, to read Article 2, powers of the President, as providing an absolute privilege against a subpoena essential to enforce of criminal statutes on no more than a generalized claim of the public interest in the confidentiality of non-military and non-diplomatic discussions would upset the constitutional balance of a workable government and gravely impair the role of the courts under Article 3. This seems like an extension of our previous answer.
Yeah, kind of an explanation for it. I agree.
Against the President's claim of executive privilege stood the Sixth Amendment rights of the accused to subpoena evidence, and the Fifth Amendment guarantees against being deprived of liberty without due process of law. The court weighed these claims and concluded, without access to specific facts, a criminal prosecution may be totally frustrated. The President's broad interest in confidentiality will not be violated by disclosure of a limited number of preliminary conversations shown to have some bearing on the pending criminal cases. In short, the court concluded the President's claim cannot prevail over the fundamental demands of due process of law in the fair administration of criminal justice. Okay, just going to check our third question here. So our third question, is there more or less power here for the President? Is there anything in here that kind of answers that question, or do we need to continue?
I think here where they say the President's broad interest in confidentiality, so his interest, his need to keep things secret, will not be vitiated by a disclosure of a limited number. So disclosure meaning showing a few preliminary, which means beforehand, conversations that have bearing on pending criminal cases. So what I see when I see that, I'm seeing that they're saying, yes, the President sometimes needs to keep things secret, but showing us a few facts that are important to this case, to this trial, he can't, like, it's not within his power to keep these things secret if we need to know them for the trial. So for me, that starts to answer the third question.
I would agree. I think another big part of that is this very last part of the last sentence. The President's claim cannot prevail over fundamental demands of due process of law and fair administration of criminal justice.
Yeah, they're definitely checking the President a little.
I think what we've highlighted here kind of shows the court weighing checks and balances, so to speak, what the President can do versus what the Constitution says absolutely needs to happen. Finally, the court ordered certain safeguards on the handling of the tapes while in possession of the district court. These safeguards included that they be examined by the judge in private, that only relevant material would be used, and that confidentiality would be preserved as far as possible, and that the material would be safely returned. Not a lot happening there. It's all
That's
kind of
really
nice.
interesting though, because if you watch the Senate hearings, although they only play certain clips, eventually after this decision, the Senate hearings play like full clips to the whole public of these tapes. So while they had to start this way, preserving that power, eventually the public got to hear what was going on too, which I just think that's interesting. I didn't know that.
When Nixon still hesitated to turn the tapes over to the Senate committee, the House recommended that the president be impeached. Nixon then released the tapes, which revealed his role in the cover-up, and 4 days later, he resigned the presidency, the first president in the history of the U.S. to do so. So we've still got question number 3 kind of hanging out in the background. Is there more or less power for the president? Just with this last sentence here, I'm going to highlight when Nixon still hesitated to turn over the tapes, that one. I'm going to argue for less. You know, the court's ruling on executive privilege, the Senate is going to receive the tapes, they never do, and then the House starts like, you need to be impeached. So we kind of see this power slipping away from the president.
I would absolutely agree with that. I think in the whole, this decision by the court, the tapes will have to be reviewed and the president has to turn the information over because it's not about national security. Like, I think that definitely maintains a limit on the president's power and reduces his informal power.
Right. So over to the side, I'm writing less power because executive privilege is being limited. We've got some things to do over here on the side before we go. A summary of what the court said. So we know that they said he's got to hand over the tapes, that this does not fall under executive privilege, and that power of executive privilege is kind of slipping away from the president. So I'm just going to list those things in my sentence here.
And Micah's, I know we talked a lot about thinking about the decision, like who won, right? Which side of the case won? In this case, it would be the United States, right? Because the Supreme Court said the people have an interest in the Congress knowing this information. The president doesn't get to protect it. So if we're thinking of a decision as who won in the moment, it's the United States, right? They won. They got the information they wanted.
One of the things I've made room over here just for Ms. MacLean's class is our precedent. So as I'm writing here, Ms. MacLean, why don't you go ahead and lead us?
Absolutely. So the way we like to talk about precedent is what happened in the future, right? So what does this case mean for the future of America? If you guys remember, I think I pointed out that we're going to want to go back to this quote up in the first paragraph on the second page, starting with the court found this argument insufficient. And we said this quote here is the Chief Justice explaining his ruling. And he says, if this had been a claim to protect military, diplomatic, or sensitive national security secrets, things might have been different, right? So this quote tells us what the court is going to accept in the future as executive privilege. So the precedent in this case is the way executive privilege is defined in the future. So I would say the precedent is that executive privilege is defined as relating to, it's connected to, as relating to military, diplomatic, or national security secrets, right? This set the precedent that the president himself can't just keep something secret because he doesn't want people to know. There has to be one of these 3 reasons for him to keep it secret. So that's how we would define the precedent.
Our last question, you're probably used to it from doing so many case studies. Is this an example of judicial activism or is it an example of judicial restraint? Okay. So is the court like actively changing something for better or worse, or is it keeping things the same again for better or worse? And then how do we know?
So if I remember, Ms. Crowe, activism is when the court changes something, right? And then restraint is when it holds back. Okay.
Yes.
Interesting.
Part of me wants to go ahead and argue that this is activism, just based on this precedent that we just wrote down. We're creating a definition for something that is A, a thing that presidents have used before in the past, but B, not actually mentioned in the Constitution. That's going to be a huge change for presidents in the future.
Yeah. I think the jurisdiction part, like at first it almost felt like restraint to me because they were talking about Article 3 and like following that more closely. But then when they start creating their own definition, that's when I would start calling it activism too.
So do we want to call
a new thing?
Do we want to call this activism then?
I think that's what I would call it, yeah.
All right. So this is judicial activism. Because while the court is relying on the Constitution, it's ultimately changing what executive privilege is. And how it can be used. All right. We also asked you to take care of 3 questions down here at the bottom. Questions number 1, number 3, and number 5. We're going to talk about these for a minute. Your answers, obviously, again, don't need to match ours. This is just to give you a starting point so that you can answer them for yourself. So number 1, what reasons did the president give for justifying his claim of executive privilege?
So what I see here is we want to go back to the first page. And we said the president claimed executive privilege shielded him for 2 reasons. So I'm going to try and put those reasons in my own words. That's how I go about answering that, right? I know the answer is the last paragraph of the first page, and I'm going to go back and put those 2 reasons in my own words. So the first, it says it was necessary to protect the confidentiality of high-level presidential communications. So important to protect confidentiality, I hear the president has to be able to keep secrets. He has to be able to keep things confidential. He has to be able to keep secrets. So that would be the first thing I talked about in that question. Second, separation of powers protects the president through the independence of the executive branch. So that's talking about how the branches are constructed under the Constitution. We talked about how separation of powers meant that different branches got to do different things. I guess they're arguing in this case that the presidential branch gets to keep things secret if they need to. But I would say because we had read in the paragraph right above that the judicial powers in Article 3 cover secrets as well and cover basically checking the branch, because separation of powers, you can't have that without checks and balances. And so I would say that the second reason supposedly was that this was the president's job and the other branches shouldn't interfere. But of course, we found that to be incorrect. Or the court found that to be incorrect.
Number 3, do you agree or disagree with the court's decision that a president must reveal material that he has recorded for his own use if it is needed as evidence in a criminal trial? It says explain here, so we gotta have reasons why you agree or disagree.
That's a hard one. So having just watched the current events that happened with the Trump impeachment, Ms. Crowe, I don't know if your class covered that. We did a few like quick readings on it, and I know a lot of you guys were following it independently on your own. We saw some of this again, right, with President Trump not wanting to let witnesses speak, and in the Senate, the trial, we talked about how they were arguing over the rules. For me, I tend to side with agreeing that the president must reveal material that he's recorded if it's needed as evidence in a criminal trial. And the evidence I would cite for that, so my answer is that I would agree. The evidence I would cite for that would come from that paragraph in the middle of the second page against the president's claim of executive privilege, right? They talk about the Sixth Amendment and the Fifth Amendment. So we talk about those amendments as protecting people when they're going on trial, but in this case, they protect the public from the president keeping things secret if they're needed in the trial. They talk about how if this information has bearing on pending criminal cases, the president has to turn it over. So I would say agree because of the Fifth and Sixth Amendment guaranteeing due process and meaning that you can hold a trial if you need to hold a trial, basically.
I would agree. That would be my reasoning, exactly, those Fifth and Sixth Amendments. So number 5 here, very last one. A constitutional scholar has written that the most important contribution of the Nixon case is in its reaffirmation that even the highest officer of government is not beyond the reach of the law and the courts. Explain in your own words what this means and how this conclusion relates to the idea of a democratic government.
So what I think when I hear this, right, a reaffirmation means they're agreeing, they're reaffirming, they're saying this is true. Even the highest officer of government, we talked about how the president, he's the leader, right? He's the number one guy up top, he's the face of the world, is not beyond the reach of the law and the courts. So that means the courts apply to the president. I might actually go back to that same paragraph again, right? Talking about how due process, subpoenas, needing evidence, all of those things, even though he's the president, they still apply, right? And so I think what this constitutional scholar is saying is that even the president has to follow the law, and even the president is subject to our laws. Like, we hold the written word higher than any one person. And you see that with the idea that the Constitution is our supreme law, right? We talked about the supremacy clause in the Constitution. The Constitution and our written laws come before any person's words or situations. And that's important because it relates to democratic government that comes from the people, because the people set those words where they want them, and then we have to respond to those words. One person, one king, one dictator, one president isn't allowed to come along and just change them without the people's input. So they're being held accountable. It's about accountability and limiting their power.
Yep, I would agree again. I think this kind of touches on the question we talked about yesterday from the videos about how the president can represent the idea of limited government.
Absolutely.
All right, well, that's our annotations here for US versus Nixon. If you have any questions for us, you can leave them in the comments, and we'll do our best to get back to you.
Absolutely. And thank you so much, kiddos, for watching. It was good to get to do some government again. This is really fun, Miss Crowe. Maybe we'll start a podcast for you guys one day.
Yes, we totally need to.
You should. So coming up next, you guys should be on the lookout. We're going to have some more of those SAT questions that you love so much. I know. We're going to talk through those. So that's what's coming up next. Get excited. Again, as always, reach out to us if you've got questions, comments, concerns. We're going to keep you updated as much as possible. And I hope you guys are having a great week.